Well, good afternoon, everybody. The clock has struck 1, and in the time-honored tradition of Racing Together webinars, we're going to be very brutal with our time today as we relaunch the Racing Together webinar series from 1 o'clock until 1:45. And what a way to welcome back our audience. We have a stellar panel lined up this afternoon to tackle a very big subject. But firstly, welcome to you, the audience. Some of you may be new to Racing Together webinars. We did 6 of them in our series 1. Delighted to be launching series 2 today, which will consist of 4 webinars, one more before Christmas on December the 1st, and then a couple early in the new year. At the end of today's session, we'll have a graphic giving details of the next webinar. We'd love you to sign up and subscribe to receive details of that, with some exciting panelists and some better known hosts for our next 3 webinars. But we're delighted to be back. Racing Together, most of you may know, is the umbrella brand for all the community engagement engaged with the sport of horse racing. We're delighted it's a growing partnership, and as such, one of our responsibilities is really to act as a resource and a communicator for the sport in this way, and the webinar series has been born out of that. This has been recorded today, so those of you who may have to duck away or would love to share it with your colleagues, and then please do so. It'll be available on our website tomorrow, and even as a podcast. So absolutely no excuse not to find a way of listening to this webinar, which will be totally worth it. I can promise you that. And a survey also will be popping up at the end as well. So I think that's most of the housekeeping matters covered. So let's get stuck into the action, because today we talk about sport as a vehicle for social change, and what can racing learn from others? Well, what a very big subject that is. We are days away, are we not, from Qatar welcoming Ecuador, I believe, for the opening game of the 2022 World Cup. And if ever there was a global event where social change has been in the microscope, then that's certainly one of those. And only this morning we saw Kevin Sinfield, the ex-rugby league player, on his 5th, I think, of 7 ultra marathons. I'm sure Chris will talk to that later. Tremendous raising awareness for motor neuron disease. 2 examples where sport is leaping beyond the back pages onto the front pages. But without further ado, I'd ask the panel to introduce themselves. Gary, if I can start with you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gary Stanitz. I'm currently the CEO for the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, and we have a partnership underway with the Jockey Club, which is how Rio Ferdinand Foundation's engaged with racing. And previous to this, I've probably worked for the last 25 years in the sport for development, sport for social change space, as a frontline coach and youth worker, through managing national programs to working with colleagues to train up organisations internationally. So yeah, 25 years long in this piece of work. So looking forward to talking with colleagues around this.
Hello, my name's Chris James. I'm Director of External Affairs with the MND Association. I've worked in the voluntary sector for too long. It's been a long career in the sector, over 30 years. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. Quite a bit of experience in working with different sports and social engagement. So very much looking forward to it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricky Reynolds. I am Head of Community Development here at MCC. So MCC are the owners of Lord's Cricket Ground, one of the most active cricket clubs in the world. And my role is to increase access to cricket and the venue in the local community. So yeah, likewise, looking forward to chat this afternoon.
Hi everyone, my name's Kelly Smith. I'm the Insight and Engagement Manager at the Sport for Development Coalition, which is a growing sort of network of about 250 organisations that use sport as a tool for social change. Really looking forward to speaking with you this afternoon.
Wonderful. Well, as I'm sure you'll agree, we're an absolutely stellar panel. We're delighted to have everyone along. And also, in terms of participation, anyone who is watching and listening who has a question, please do feel free to send us a message in the chat box. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the world of Zoom now. So any questions that you have, pop them in there and we'll try and fit them in as well, and bring them to the panel as well. Kelly, if I can start with you, if I may, and let's start with the big one. What do we mean by social change? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think in a sort of coalition context, As I mentioned, we've got about 250 organisations now that are a part of the coalition movement, and all of those organisations, whether they're sporting or non-sporting, use sport, physical activity, movement as a tool to create positive social outcomes. We find there's a real range of outcomes that these organisations are working towards. Over the past kind of year and a bit, we've looked with our sort of coalition members to try and look at kind of what are the common themes that are coming up around these outcomes. And we've identified kind of 5 key ones in our sort of shared advocacy framework called the Open Goal Framework. And those are improved health and well-being, increasing employability and skills, reducing crime and antisocial behaviour, closing the gap in education and development, and stronger communities and social cohesion. But what we know actually for a lot of organisations using sport for social change and sport for development is that when a participant comes onto a programme, it might be an employability and skills programme, one of the first things that happens with their coaches and mentors is there's an increase in their sort of improved health and well-being and their mental health before they can then go sort of start achieving those kind of employability and skills outcomes as well. So what we're seeing is kind of multiple returns and multiple outcomes when a young person or a participant joins a sport for development program. So it's kind of that multiple returns on investment when you engage in a kind of sport for social change program that we're seeing.
And Gary, I mean, I imagine a lot of that would chime with not just your current job, but your wealth of experience. Social cohesion and education are just two of the elements that Kelly hovered on then. Would there be any differences in your assessment of social change?
Not really. I think Kelly's pretty much hit it on the spot. I mean, for us, it's around how do we use sport to make an impact on pressing social issues of the day. So for us in my current role, a lot of that is around the current sort of the socioeconomic factors around poverty, around unemployment, around lack of opportunities, particularly in those communities that have been under-resourced traditionally. But as Kelly said, what you will find is whichever program you put in, you end up hitting a lot of multiple factors. If you get young people involved, if they are exposed to positive role models, if they're exposed to opportunities, if they're exposed to new experiences, then you will see young people's attitudes change, and hopefully that will roll on into their peer group and wider society. So I would probably I'd probably say that Kelly hit the nail on the head from my side. It's just around how do we use sport to tackle the pressing social issues of the day, and when you get involved in it, you do tend to find that a whole range of things unfold before you as you move forward, in my experience.
And Chris, and I say your brief, it might be narrower, take that in the way that's meant in terms of your specific role, but we've heard from obviously Kelly and Gary about some very big society-wide sort of issues. Your role for motor neuron disease obviously is very focused on that area, understandably. Again, how would you answer that question around what social change sort of means to you?
Yeah, I think for us, it's very interesting. Motor neuron disease, or ALS, as it is sometimes known, is a disease that's not particularly well known. Condition is not well known. It's certainly not as well known as other diseases. So what we've found in recent years with the diagnosis actually of some leading sports people in the UK, Doddy Weir possibly was the first, the Scottish Rugby Union player, and then leading on to people like Len John Rose, the footballer, and Stephen Darby, the footballer, and then most recently Rob Burrow, the rugby league player, is that it gives an opportunity to really engage with a community. And that's one of the things that's been really striking for us, is that how we've been able to engage with that rugby community, particularly rugby union and league, coming together. And it helps us to really raise awareness of the disease. And I think importantly for people with MND, it actually gives a sense of hope. There's no treatment or cure for MND. And so that community coming together and the way it's been touched, and that relationship that we found, you referenced Kev Sinfield earlier on, who's over halfway now through his 7 ultra marathons. His friendship with Rob and the coverage that has generated has really engaged people and helped us introduce M&D to a wider community. So that's really the great thing about the way that the people, these very brave sports people, actually living their lives very publicly with what is a very devastating disease has been really important.
And spear pointing a particular sport, I mean, rugby league again has been such a great ally, I think, to you, Chris, and Ricky. Obviously, at the home of cricket, at Lords, obviously very defined sport, and the attraction piece with regard to cricket. Again, what's your sort of interpretation of social change, and how do you fit that within your brief and objectives?
I think it's been covered in terms of definition already. I think from our perspective in how that looks practically from our kind of local community work, what we tend to do in the summer for us and during the cricket season, the sport is the priority. But in the winter, actually, we flip that on its head, and the individual, it becomes the priority of our program. And actually we look at teaching and focusing on the kind of attributes that cricket can bring, whether that's, leadership skills, communication skills, respect, and all of those skills that most sports can offer. And I think racing is an obvious one as well. So for us, we actually got feedback from schools that it's something to roll out annually throughout the school curriculum. There's clearly a need for it, that actually we are talking to kids through a slightly different lens that teachers perhaps can't engage with. And I think every school and every sport, has that ability to talk to kids through a slightly different lens and get that buy-in and potentially open up conversations that perhaps you can't do in the classroom.
And a question has just come in now from our colleague Morag, and I think it's a good time to drop it in. It would be around COVID, and obviously that presented everyone with a challenge. But during our response to COVID and the aftermath, has that, to any of your organizations and your roles, presented a new opportunity and a new momentum, perhaps? Maybe Gary, what lessons learned, if you like, for coming out of COVID in terms of those specific objectives?
To be honest, before we go on to opportunities, John, I think probably I would feedback that it's actually had to change the way that we work with you. We basically focus on working with young people. So I'm always going to talk around young people when I'm talking around our work. What we found is actually things have changed quite a lot as young people have come out of COVID. The way that they socialize has changed quite massively. Obviously, they've had 18 months. We're in lockdown, a lot of communications on social media. I think we've seen young people that are coming on our programs that are suffering some serious signs of anxiety. And I think the associated sort of broader mental health resilience issues that young people are facing has been talked about quite drastically. I think within that, there's a little bit of a nervousness around some young people and their parents letting them come out to engage in programs on the streets. So I think we've got those sort of challenges that threw up. I think talking more broadly, we've also we're looking at a lot of the work the Rio Ferdinand Foundation does is around how we look at tackling division and how we look at social mobility. And I think division has been a bit entrenched because we've kind of had the COVID thing, which meant people stayed in their own homes and with their very, very close peer groups. I think that alongside COVID, we had Brexit. We won't get into politics of that, but I think the division is very, very clear that's starting to emerge in society, which has made it more difficult in some ways to break down barriers. And then lastly, kids have been out of school for nearly, for 18 months, so they were learning online. And that obviously impacts on young people and the way that they learn and the sort of ongoing social mobility issues. So I think my first point, John, would be that we've had to seriously review how we work with young people. And I think the things we're doing now is we probably are working in smaller groups. So there's a closer relationship between our coaches and our youth workers and the young people we work with. I think we are probably having to invest further upstream in young people's development at a very sort of early stage of instilling confidence, instilling communication skills, and letting them build their aspirations. And I think also, just lastly, we probably just have to think a little bit more carefully around how we can support those young people into the various progression pathways that we have. I think we just had to slow it down a little bit compared to where we were pre-COVID, just because young people in society have changed. I think if there is a benefit to that, I think that a lot of those issues have been well recognised in society at large. We've certainly found that businesses, local authorities have been far more open to investing in these kind of programs than perhaps they were previously, because they recognise that unemployment, mental health epidemic is there. And I think that in itself opens up more opportunities for us to work with young people in a different way and broaden their horizons and ambitions into what is achievable. So that would probably be my answer. There were a lot of negatives coming out of COVID that we've had to adapt to. But I think that maybe the work that we do is probably more broadly recognised now, and people buy into the things we're trying to achieve a lot more than maybe they did just before COVID. That's my take anyway.
And Kelly, with your sort of purview of wider sports, have you found that there has been a pickup in the momentum post-COVID, a change of direction maybe, or perhaps a lack of recovery to the sort of the impetus of some of these programs before COVID struck?
Yeah, I agree with kind of what Gary was saying. I think there is kind of a bit more recognition now and value placed on those organisations that kind of Sport for Social Change and organisations that were really embedded in the communities during COVID. We found that the organisations within our network, they adapted their services. So whether that was becoming a food bank for a period of time, whether that was taking their sort of sports sessions into the street so they could be done at socially distance, whether that was taking sort of activity parcels round to families, older people as well, checking on sort of the local community. They were really embedded and just, they didn't think twice about being told what they should be doing. They just adapted what they already had. And they supported their community and they really responded to the challenge during COVID. And I think that has helped kind of recognise the value of these organisations within our communities up and down the country. I think in terms of sort of recovery from the pandemic, it's quite difficult because we're in the midst of the worst kind of cost of living crisis we've seen for sort of decades. And I think there's real pressure coming on these organisations to keep the lights on and keep going, but also the pressure on sort of those communities that are the most vulnerable. A lot of our organisations work with kind of the most deprived communities within the UK. So there is kind of real sort of fear and real sort of pressure on those organisations. So to keep supporting, but yeah, it's a very difficult situation. It's difficult to say.
And Ricky, cricket seems to me at least the most adaptable sport in recent time. It changes its format. World champions of white ball cricket and all the great stuff that's going on the field, as it were. But in terms of your side and the community engagement side and using sport as a vehicle for social change, which is what we're addressing today, has there been an adaptability in your work and your colleagues in what you've had to do to, as I said, keep that sort of momentum going post-COVID?
I think the first thing that we've realised is the gap has got bigger, and those that were struggling before are struggling even more so, and those that weren't probably are again at the opposite end of that scale. And we realised that again, mental health was possibly the biggest challenge that we were going to have to face in terms of it on a local level. And whilst the profile and the conversation is more prevalent now in terms of the stigma of mental health is slowly going, the number of the issues that we're facing in terms of pure quantity are increasing. So for us, it's around actually just putting cricket in the right places at the right time, and actually going into these communities and not expecting communities to come to us and come and find us, actually proactively going to places we haven't been to before and engaging with organisations that have that access, have those touch points with people that are struggling, and almost becoming a signposting mechanism to play a positive role in people's mental health. And what cricket has the ability to do, and you've kind of touched on it there are multiple formats, there are multiple ways people can engage in the sport, and it's losing that perception of you don't need a big open green space to take part in the sport. And that's something that the game has got better at over the years. And for us, it's just kind of hammering home that message that yes, we're the home of cricket, but there are multiple ways in which you can play the game and interact with the game. You don't have to be standing in a field in whites, and you know that all of the things that people think of on the village green, and it's relevant in all communities.
And Chris, unlike Gary, Ricky, and Kelly, who are far more immersed in sport on a sort of day-to-day basis, obviously your role's more zoomed out than that. Do you think sport is missing a trick or tricks in terms of what else it can be doing in a general sense?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I mean, I think there is an opportunity. What I've really noticed, as I was saying earlier, in the last 2 or 3 years, is that that sporting community is extraordinarily strong, whether that's on a national level, sort of rugby league or rugby union or football as a whole, but at a local level, at a club level as well. That opportunity to engage at a local level is really, really important. And we particularly noticed that with people, with footballers, for example, like Len John Rose and Stephen Darby, who played for a number of clubs during their career, that ability to go out. And Len John Rose, who sadly died quite recently, was going out to clubs actually to talk about MND, talk about his experience of MND, raise awareness of MND with the football clubs. And I think that was really, really important to that local community engagement. And similarly, we a rugby player called Ed Slater, who plays for Gloucester, has recently been diagnosed with MND. And Gloucester's a relatively small city. The rugby club is massively important to Gloucester. And so it touches almost the whole community in Gloucester. And therefore, the rugby club is then thrust into the centre of that, actually. And they've responded extraordinarily well. And similarly with Rob Burrow and Kev Sinfield, who both played for Leeds, colleagues at Leeds Rhinos for many, many years, the way that Leeds Rhinos have engaged with them in terms of the racing. I mean, Leeds Rhinos have essentially organised Ken's 7-in-7 Ultra. That's a massive thing to have to organise. Lots of stopping points, lots of meeting points, constant media coverage. That's really, really important. So I think getting engaged both at a national level, but at a local club and community level is also, certainly for MND, it's made a huge difference in the last 2 or 3 years, massive difference.
And staying with that point then around role models, because obviously rugby league is a great example, both in terms of those you support, but those that their former colleagues who are supporting them as well, and rugby union as well. And Gary, maybe pick up on this, that the use of individual sports people as role models. Your foundation is named after one of the most recognizable people in sport, highly decorated, and hugely well respected in his current life, his non-playing life. Do you think there's more that we should expect from individuals, or are there limits to what perhaps we can ask of role models when it comes to some of these very meaty areas you've all been talking about, and the social change that we want?
I think that's always a difficult question to answer, John, because I think you use the word individual, and that's exactly right. It's about the individual. I think it's around, if the individual, in our case Rio, and obviously we've seen the way the rugby league community has come around as Chris has sort of said. I think if you've got athletes, personalities who genuinely believe in the issue, who genuinely want to get involved and will put their weight into the programs, and kind of use their networks to raise awareness and to generate sort of momentum, then I think that's a massive advantage that you can have, because of that status and that reach they have, and that they can, as Chris has just said, they can mobilize a whole community in rugby league around that particular issue. So I think that's sort of obviously the bigger the sort of benefit, if you like, of using sports people as role models, or at least ambassadors for our movement. I think that it really comes down to the individual, though. You can't ask every single athlete and every single sportsman to do that, because if they don't genuinely believe in what they're doing, if there's a little bit of lip service being paid, then I think it can have quite harmful effects, because then people can get very, very cynical around why sports people are involved. So that would probably be my first sort of part of my answer to you, John. I think the second thing, though, that we should think about is when we use the term role models, we probably need to sort of think a little bit more grassroots, really. Rio is a role model in some ways, right? People will look up to him. I think he can inspire, he can motivate. But if we're working on an estate in Salford, Rio's not going to be there every week. Rio's not going to be the person that's going to be mentoring that young person. It's going to be the coach, the youth worker that's actually on the ground, on the estates, that has come from that background. So my sort of take on that sort of role models is we probably need to look a little bit closer to home and identify who is a role model and how do we invest and support those people, because they're the ones who will have the day-to-day, week-to-week impact. The people like Rio, for me, they're great because they do bring that support. It makes the programs aspirational. It opens up doorways and conversations that you can have. But without my guys on the ground, then the programs wouldn't stack up, would probably be my answer. So role models, yes, we can look at those athletes, but let's look at the guys that are actually doing, and girls that are actually doing the work on the ground and delivering week to week.
And is that the same for you, Ricky? Because obviously our first person we would think of perhaps is the England Test captain, which is Ben Stokes, who's taken time away from the game, with being very honest about his own mental health challenges. He's not the only cricketer in any sense to have done that. So that in some way has elevated the importance of talking about mental health as a starting point. But is that your experience as well as managing, as Gary has said there, the expectation and the limitations on role models, as opposed to those that are, you know, getting dirty week in and week out?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Gary's just said. I think the element of it being authentic as well, and actually people genuinely believing what they're saying and not just being rolled out and here's a camera, here's a script, can you go and read that to camera type thing, which we do see, you know, not just in cricket but in other sports. And I think people are slowly realizing that, and what's genuine and what's not. And I think if you're not genuine, you're almost doing more harm than not doing it at all. And I think Gary's point around just on the ground and grassroots, you know, completely agree again. You know, your program is only as good as the people delivering it. And if young people and whoever's taking part in your programs have someone who's genuinely bought in to that session week in, week out, that is going to do so much good in comparison to someone recording a message on social media. You know, having that day-to-day interaction that they may not get in everyday life at family home or at school. Actually, our sports being that outlet that people have that conversation they want to have, but probably don't feel they can do in their everyday life.
We're going to get into some of racing's challenges with the 18 minutes we've got left. We need a lot more for racing's challenges on that, but I want to ask some specific questions, and thank you for those that have dropped those in the chat box. We'll get to those, but one of them I want to start with actually is from Claire Kubler, who is in the training ranks, and she asks, there's a lot of emphasis on engaging younger people, but what examples do we have of projects for the benefit of the elderly in our communities? Maybe I'll just throw that one open to, rather than pick on someone, who'd like to maybe have a go at that one.
I'd be happy to give a few examples.
Please, Kelly.
that I know of from the sort of Sport for Development Coalition network. I mean, there can be some examples of services which are helping sort of elderly people to get active. It might be through maybe walking football or a walking group, but the kind of key part of that is, yes, the physical activity is important, but also the social aspect and sort of looking to sort of decrease loneliness. I also know of a great foundation called Sporting Memories Foundation, which work with elderly people in communities. So it's, again, the sort of social aspect coming around, talking about sort of great sporting memories that they have. It might be within sort of cricket, it might be within rugby or football, but it's really sort of emphasis on that social element, and sport is kind of the hook to sort of bring people in. Also sort of Age UK, I know, do a lot of work on sort of getting elderly people within communities active, and a lot of their work can be sort of done from within a chair, sort of chair-based yoga, and other sort of provisions that they put on as well. So I think with sort of Gary's work and a lot of the sort of coalition's work, there is a bit of a focus on young people, but there is sort of so much that sport can do as well, and sport, physical activity and movement can do for elderly people, particularly through, if you look at sort of social prescribing and integrated care systems with the NHS and helping people to manage kind of long-term health conditions. We're starting to see some great research pieces come out around sort of social prescribing as well.
I think if I could just jump in there,
please.
John, just sort of from our perspective, or my perspective, over the years, I've worked on a lot of programs that actually use sport on an intergenerational basis. So how do we connect young people, parents, grandparents, and communities together through sport? So I know the Jason Roberts Foundation, for example, a couple of years ago did a big one around the Stonebridge estate, where they in West London, where they used sport to bring together people from all generations to exchange stories, and it became a sort of social history project through sport. And I think that the feedback was that connected literally young people, grandparents, in a way that very little had before. And similarly, I also know around that there's an organisation that Ricky might be aware of called Cage Cricket, that do a lot of work around bringing grandparents and children together to play as a pair in a form of cricket that kind of helps build those relationships. So I think the two aren't mutually exclusive. I think that there's a lot of intergenerational work joining communities through sport as well. And I think that that's probably an area that I'm seeing more and more of as we look at this rebuilding communities sort of approach that we picked up after Brexit. After COVID and everything else that's gone with it. So yeah, just thought that might be of interest.
And Chris, on that topic as well, I mean, your beneficiaries will come, across all age ranges, obviously, but clearly you will have programs that are specific to older people.
Yeah, absolutely. Right through from branches and groups, support groups at a local level, right through to our grants program, where we provide grants for people and advice for people. And much of our work is focused around older people with MND. The most common diagnosis age is between 50 and 70. So a lot of our work is there to support those groups. And I think probably the other thing to say is it also helps to support those people through awareness of MND as well, so that it helps us to campaign and lobby on their behalf for better services through health and social care. So that's another important element of the sporting awareness raising that's going into MND at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. Just passing to you, Gary, if I may, just honing in, I'm conscious of time in terms of racing, because we're here, most of the audience, or all of the audience will have an interest, professional or otherwise, in horse racing. We want to see what racing can learn from thinking and from what other organizations are doing. Obviously, we're not starting at ground zero here. There has been plenty of work across racing for many, many years, an incredibly charitable sport with lots of programs. But I think a real standout program is the work with the Jockey Club that the Rio Ferdinand Foundation has already got underway. Can you just tell us a little bit, for those that don't know, a little bit about that, and maybe picking up from a question from one of the audience, the strategic priority of it? I mean, what are the hoped for outcomes?
Okay, so the partnership between the Rio Ferdinand Foundation and the Jockey Club has probably been born out of and John, you would know, sort of, we've had a bit of an interest in how racing can sort of engage with particularly urban, working class, non-traditional racing audiences for quite a while, because it is such a, racing is such a, it has such a part of the British sporting landscape, but we've seen it all our lives, and the amount of coverage it gets. But perhaps it doesn't connect as well with the younger generation, or certainly young people that we've been working with in Manchester, Belfast, and London. So for us, we were really sort of looking for a partner that could work with us to look at three things, I think, which I think would be the objectives. One, how do we start to find out ways we can engage racing with those new non-traditional younger audiences in a way that is both engaging, it can broaden its audience, but and access and people going to the racing. So that was the first piece. The second one was very much around how can we use the broad diversity of careers in racing to actually start to help improving young people's employability, broadening their sort of their confidence, their access, their understanding of what careers are. And then finally, of course, bringing that all together, hopefully bringing young people into the racing workforce in all of its forms. So we're not just talking about a jockey, obviously. There's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes between media, grounds people. I mean, there's a whole range of roles there. So I guess that would be the focus, really. It's around engaging racing with communities, training and getting employability outcomes for young people, and hopefully getting those young people into working careers within the racing industry.
Excellent. And Ricky, from your knowledge and interaction with racing, do you see potential and a capacity for the sport to maybe do something that other sports aren't doing?
I think one thing from the outside looking in, I think I always come back when talking about cricket. There's kind of three things that we believe that the sport and venues can offer, and Gary's touched on it there. Firstly, your staff, whatever organisation you're working in, everybody has a knowledge area of what they do, of racing, whether it's racing itself, whether it's their day job in marketing, finance, HR, whatever that is, and it's using that platform to share that knowledge and upskill your community, and then hopefully that progresses into job opportunities at venues, and then the venue itself. We've touched on it in terms of work with older people, just the work we do here at Lords. We do a lot of work around dementia and socially isolated groups, and actually just opening up the doors of a venue, whether that be a cricket ground or a racecourse, is for some people just putting the kettle on and having a roundtable discussion is something that can be so powerful for communities that have very little opportunities. And then you look at the sport itself. Great if we can go on and get people into cricket, football, racing, whatever that may be. But ultimately, there are multiple touch points that sport can have. And I think, from my perspective, if there's a lot of easy wins out there, and it doesn't actually need that much resource or budget, whatever those barriers are internally to get these projects off the ground, to get them started on a small scale, I think they're very easily done if you have that buy-in internally.
And Kelly, again, from your knowledge of and working alongside other sports, are there things that specific areas that racing can learn from, and maybe that low-hanging fruit that Ricky alluded to, that racing is not just there yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of both what sort of Ricky and particularly what Gary was saying in the sort of description of the partnership that they're working with on the Jockey Club already, you're seeing sort of that increasing engagement with communities that wouldn't normally engage. That's a big part of sort of what Sport for Social Change does, and through sort of tackling inequalities, whether that's sort of health and societal, but also that sort of employability piece. I think there's real opportunities with the employability piece, but also I think maybe racing specifically, there's the opportunity for young people to go into environments that maybe they wouldn't normally ever visit or ever really get to see. There's opportunity to kind of be outside, and the sort of benefits that can have in terms of sort of mental health and well-being. I think there's a lot of great spaces and places that racing could probably learn from that already exist, and just look at kind of what's the transferable element. Is it the employability bit that's transferable? Is it the sort of improved mental health and well-being? I think there's plenty of opportunity for racing within that.
And Chris, taking that forward, how can racing, for example, work more closely or be a better ally, supporter of your organisation?
Well, it's quite interesting. In recent years, actually, the MND has engaged with racing through Rob Burrow and the development of the Burrow 7 Racing Club. Burrow 7, obviously a horse, and people were invited to become a member of the scheme. So that's been really, really exciting. It's something new. I certainly never seen it before within my experience within the voluntary sector, and it's given people an opportunity to support the cause through racing. and obviously prize draws, opportunities to meet the horse, to go to the races, to become engaged in that way, raised an extraordinary over £100,000, which is wonderful in itself. But also that awareness raising has been really effective. So I think there are opportunities there. This is probably not the only thing that racing could do in terms of engaging with charitable work, but certainly an exciting, I thought, pretty innovative relationship, and it's certainly been hugely valuable in raising awareness of MND with perhaps a newer community of people. So that's been really exciting.
People in racing talk a lot about its social license, and you could perm one of 3 or 4 explanations around that to allow racing to take place. Horse welfare might be the first one that comes to mind. Do any of you, and just throw it open to you, does anyone feel that racing has a particular barrier in that sense of being an effective vehicle for social change? Are there unique things about racing in this area that may stymie its efforts, do you think? Does anyone think?
If I can jump in then, John, obviously we've just been through that little bit of experience and the mapping exercise that we've done with the Jockey Club. I think there is a challenge for racing. And again, sorry, but I'm going to go back to the young people sort of side of things again. When we talk to young people, I think there's a bit of for the young people we work with, I think the image of racing didn't actually seem to be that appealing. I think on the one hand, they either saw it as being top hats, tails, and champagne, as you would see on the coverage on television, or they tended to relate it to the betting shop on the high street and all of the negativity that goes around that. And I think that, you know, we have to be quite honest and say that there is probably a perception challenge, and that's why the first step of what we're doing with the Jockey Club is around actually trying to get young people. We're trying to demystify racing for young people, I guess. And I think also just to sort of say that the staff at the Jockey Club have been really, really engaging with us on that. So we've had people from various careers coming down, showing young people around, talking to them around careers. So I think that there is a sort of a challenge in terms of perception, and that's where racing probably needs to get back out into the communities and talking to people and trying to open its doors a little bit. With that, we've not just focused on young people, we've taken families, youth workers, teachers along as well, just so that they understand what we're trying to achieve. And I think we're starting to see real momentum there. I think the flip side, though, of that challenge, John, is that there's a real chance of innovation. You know, young people that we've been taking to racing haven't got a clue what they're going into sometimes. They've sort of seen it, they want to go along. When they get in, they're absolutely mesmerized, inspired. You know, some of the feedback we've had from young people going to Epsom and Sandown has been brilliant. And, you know, they've gone through the whole piece of meeting the jockey, seeing the horses, talking to the people behind the scenes, doing some one-to-ones around careers. So I think that innovation and that sort of wow factor is something that racing can harness, because it's out of the norm. It's not something that young people see every day. And the fact that if you're going to do it effectively, and it kind of harks back to what Ricky was saying about opening up the stadia, the iconic venues, all of a sudden you're sort of taking them to a completely new environment. So I think within it, there is a bit of a challenge, perception, betting shops versus real opportunities for innovation and change if we harness it right and we bring the people within racing close to the young people that we're trying to get into racing.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. I'm very conscious of time, but Kelly, a question that's just come through from our audience. What can today's attendees, our audience and us and your fellow panelists, what can we learn from wider sport for development programs? What are you particularly seeing as having a cut through in this area that perhaps we can borrow, learn from?
I'd say 2 things. I think there's a real importance and drive now on organisations that are using sport as a vehicle for social change to be evidence-based and to really sort of try and measure the impact that their programmes and projects are having. And there's sort of plenty of resources out there on sort of toolkits and ways that you can measure. There's also on the Coalition website, we've got a bit of a section on this as well. And then the other bit is collaboration and partnership working. And I think sort of Gary's partnership, the Rio Ferdinand Foundation's partnership with the Jockey Club is kind of an excellent example. I'm speaking from a sort of Sport for Development Coalition perspective. We love sort of partnership and collaborative working. It's what we're all about. That's why we're kind of here to speak in kind of one united voice. But I think if racing can reach out to wider sport for development, and talk around those sort of collaborations and partnerships that can be had with organisations that are already in the communities that they're wanting to attract, then it's sort of a great way to sort of begin and go further in this area.
Wonderful. Well, like a 5-furlong sprint, this session has absolutely flown by. But I just want to finish by thanking you all so much for your insights. It's very much the start of a conversation, of course, because racing has so much to learn from other sports, and we hope to bring that to our audience through Racing Together. So you will be sent, those of you kindly tuned in, a survey after this session. Our next is on December the 1st, and Lucy Gurney, who is the brains and the engine behind all of this, has now put on screen the next episode. A nice easy question for next time around: is racing adapting fast enough to attract future fans and workforce? We hope moves seamlessly from this conversation about social change, which seems to me to be both local and personal and national and grand. It can be everything, the small difference from those on the ground to the bigger initiatives, to perhaps some social change in Qatar, who knows, over the next 4 to 5 weeks or so. But a final huge thank you to Gary, to Chris, to Ricky and Kelly. We could have heard from one of you for 45 minutes and it still would have been brilliant, but I hope you don't mind that we are going to stick to the plan. And thank you so much for all of you that tuned in. For those who want to pass it on to colleagues, and please do, it'll be on our website as of tomorrow, and a podcast as well, as I've said, and please sign up to our newsletter as well. It's been an absolute joy to drive the bus for this first webinar. And thank you so much to all of you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.